thought after the pandemic, we would examine what we had done, what worked, what didn't work, as part of a roadmap for what we should do in the future. Instead, the best we've been able to do is that recent hearing in front of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, where Dr. Fauci testified. It was ugly and mostly pointless. The testimony bogged down in a partisan debate about the origins of the virus. America's yawning divides were on display, with Democrats falling all over themselves to defend Fauci and Republicans attacking him as the devil incarnate. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene even refused to call Fauci doctor. Instead, in this display of playground bullying that speaks to our modern lack of civility, she insisted on referring to him as Mr. The problem is that there are very legitimate questions to ask. It's increasingly clear that in the pandemic, our government didn't know what it was doing. How could anyone, at least in those early months? But also that public health officials and our political leaders refused to learn as the pandemic ground on, instead disseminating favored narratives with more and more vehemence. Follow the science became a mantra for all good people. Somewhat ironic, given that there was never much science, and also somewhat ironic, given that science, at its best, is a system of asking questions, a way of formulating a thesis and a belief that then you listen to the evidence and you change that thesis. On the other hand, another moment of optimism, there was one in the pandemic, which I think is Operation Warp Speed, a fantastic example of how government and business can work together. People never thought would have a vaccine. If we did, they thought it would be years off. But people in the government, beginning with the then head of HHS, Alex Azar, both recognized that the government and business needed each other. If you were a rabid free market person, you might have said, here's a pandemic, we need a vaccine. Companies are going to make a vaccine. But the vaccine business doesn't work that way, because over time, companies that have made vaccines for pandemics have been burned because the pandemic has gone away and the vaccine has been unneeded, and they've taken losses and shareholders have punished them. So companies don't race to make vaccines. The vaccine business isn't viewed as profitable because governments are major buyers. There was not going to be a vaccine, at least not on a very fast schedule. The government understood this and realized that they had to do two things. They had to establish a market so that there would be an incentive to help companies make vaccines, and they had to fix the manufacturing process. The story of Operation Warp Speed really is a story of industrial manufacturing, because the government recognized that the vaccine manufacturing capacity didn't exist in the United States. So it wasn't just the story of the invention of a vaccine, it was the story of industrial mobilization on a major, major scale. And in order to do that, not only did government and business have to work closely together, but they all worked very closely with the Army, which of course are experts in logistics. It really was, I know one of the speakers here is the fantastic author of the Oppenheimer book, and this really was a modern day Manhattan Project, albeit with hopefully much happier results. So Moncef Slaoui was the scientific lead, and General Gustav Perna of the Army was the Leslie Groves. And I loved some of the stories about the Army operating with learning to operate with all these business people. And I thought this was a great anecdote that we all struggle with teleconferences, where you might have 20 people on the line and people are talking all over each other. But Moncef Slaoui told me, when you put 20 people from the Army on, that never happens, because they communicate the same way they do on radios. So if I'm talking, I say break if I pause, but if I'm going to continue talking, so don't interrupt me. Only at the end do I say over, so someone else can talk. He said it's very simple, strange, and effective, but he and the other business people involved were just thrilled with what they learned from the Army. I also think there's another theme here, that the people who ran Warp Speed were not defenders of the Trump administration. Moncef Slaoui was an immigrant. I think he'd forgive me for describing him as almost a socialist. He wanted nothing to do with the Trump administration. But when he got the call asking him to run Warp Speed, he put aside his politics. He sold all his stock in Moderna, despite knowing that it would probably be worth tens of millions of dollars. And he did his job for his adopted country. And And I think if more of us could set aside our politics in moments of need, we would all be the better for it.